our listeners know that calorie reduction that's driving the weight loss, it doesn't come down to just looking at fiber, but this just shows that why like successful diets can't just look at reducing calories. We have to think about, can the person stick to this diet? Are they feeling full? You know, can they sustain that caloric deficit? And so I'm guessing that the reason that fiber predicted the weight loss was because these are really the satisfying diets so that people could really sustain them.
Hello and welcome to the Consistency Project with E.C. Sinkowski. My name is Patrick Cummings, and every episode I have the privilege of having a discussion with EC on subject matters that range from nutrition to fitness to the choices we can all make to live a healthier, more functional life. By exploring both the principles at play and the actions worth carrying out as a result, it's our goal to get you thinking, get you moving, and get you taking more consistent steps toward optimizing your well-being. Thank you so much for being here this week. How are you, EC?
I'm good. I think we're
amazing.
Using another clickbait title.
I was just going to say, we got a little clickbait. So how long do we have to wait before we can reveal what the most underrated nutrient is? Can we
you can tell
how long can we make people wait?
You can tell them.
All right, we're going to talk about fiber.
Wow.
Yeah, we're going to talk about fiber. Super exciting. Okay.
That's why we can't put it in the actual title because no one will listen. We have to at least get them going here.
Okay, so we've done that. All right, so big reveal. It's going to be fiber. So let's as we do, let's do a little background, a little context. What are the basics about fiber? Why do we need it? Why do we need to talk about it?
So fiber is a non-digestible portion of carbohydrates, and part of what makes talking about fiber complicated is that that's really a broad umbrella term. It's not just one compound. There are many different types of fiber with distinct chemical structures. They include things like cellulose, pectins, fructooligosaccharides, resistant starch, guar gum, psyllium husk, inulin. There's so many different types of fiber, right?
I just want to congratulate you on fructo, whatever that was. You did that very well, and I feel like we can't go past that without acknowledging it. So good job.
Good job. So yeah, again, these compounds are the non-digestible portion of carbohydrates, which means they can't be broken down by our human digestive enzymes in the small intestine. Now, most of these fiber compounds, they do have the same building blocks as carbohydrates. So we've got them as having the same carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen molecules just stuck together. But what makes fiber different from kind of sugar is the way those molecules are stuck together prevent our digestive enzymes from breaking them down. And so this is why, though, you see fiber under carbohydrates on a nutrition label. They are, chemically related there. Now, conversely, with carbohydrates in terms of sugar and starch, we do have the enzymes that will break them down into, let's say, like the glucose and the fructose molecules, which then get absorbed in the small intestine. So the stomach is where we begin the digestion process, but it's really then the small intestine that breaks down the bulk of the food to also include fat and proteins and then absorbed into the body. But, of course, not everything gets broken down and reabsorbed, and those materials then move on to the large intestine. And that would include fiber, because that's not broken down and absorbed in the small intestine. Okay, so this is what's really interesting about fiber, and I've called it underrated, but I do believe that, yet it's not an essential nutrient. So a nutrient allows an organism to survive, grow, reproduce, where an essential nutrient is required for normal physiological function and cannot be synthesized by the body. We need to get it from our diet. And so our essential nutrients include the 9 amino acids we've mentioned before. There's 2 fatty acids, there's 13 vitamins, there's 15 minerals, and a molecule called choline, which we haven't really talked about, and maybe that'll be another podcast. But the point here is carbohydrates are not essential. So said another way, you can live without eating carbs. Now, it turns out that lots of carbs by way of plants often give us those vitamins and minerals, which are essential, but the carbohydrate themselves is not essential. And so this is how people can do something like the carnivore diet and live, usually with some supplementation. But anyway, this lack, though, of carbs being essential to live often becomes the rationale for why some of these trendy diets believe that we shouldn't eat carbs and also, therefore, fiber. But what I like to point out is I think they've incorrectly interpreted the word essential for optimal, which is a little bit weird, right? Like we have different words because they're different concepts. And we shouldn't kind of sub them out for one another. You could argue that, electricity isn't essential to live, which is correct, but I think most of us would say it makes our life more optimal, right? So just because the body can withstand all these different stressors in terms of a nutrient or food availability does not necessarily mean that's the path to optimal health. And so it's just an odd conclusion, in my opinion, to have these ideas that essential means optimal. And to add on to that, many of these people who kind of shun carbohydrates and specifically fiber because it's not essential also tend to be the people in the high saturated fat camp, which makes sense. There isn't much left for them to eat besides meat and fat once we eliminated carbs and fiber. But this is what's interesting. Saturated fat isn't essential either. So they are often against fiber because it's not essential, yet they are pro-saturated fat, which also isn't essential. The essential fatty acids are 2 polyunsaturated fats. So remember, there's 3 types of fats: saturated, monounsaturated, and polyunsaturated. And it's the 2 of the polyunsaturated fats that are essential. But I just kind of wanted to point out this dichotomy that typically the people are like, oh, that we don't need carbohydrates and we shouldn't eat carbohydrates or fiber, are typically also very pro-saturated fat, which is also a nutrient we don't need.
Interesting. It's kind of like taking the concept of paleo to its like extreme end, yes, where it's like, well, that didn't exist, so we don't need it. All the way to the point of we don't need anything.
Totally.
Okay. So you mentioned fiber is from plant foods. Can you give us a sense of just dose to a degree? Like how much do we need? Like how much of this do we need?
Yeah, the U.S. recommendations are 14 grams of fiber per every 1,000 calories. And so assuming women need 2,000 calories a day and men need 2,500 calories a day, we're talking about something like 25 to 35 grams of fiber per day. Of course, actually changing that based on your caloric intake.
Yep.
Here's the depressing fact. 5% of the U.S. population meets those fiber recommendations.
Interesting.
Like, oh my gosh,
yeah.
That's not a lot of
seriously.
People.
Yeah.
And so, when I get these questions about, do I need to worry about looking at the sun first thing in the morning, or like, do I need to jump in the cold plunge tank, something like that, sometimes it's really hard to even worry about that stuff when we have some really obvious bases that we need to cover first, please. Right. So average fiber intake in North America is about 17 grams a day. It looks to be a little bit higher in Europe, but even a paper I saw that was talking about the Western world, it was most of us should increase our dietary fiber intake by 50% of what we're currently doing. Now, in addition to this of like kind of what are the standard recommendations, I often also get the question about, well, what's optimal, right? Maybe I should get 14 grams per 1,000 calories, but is there an optimal level? And I would say that we don't really know. That recommendation for the 14 grams per 1,000 calories is basically coming from studies looking at where we can reduce cardiovascular disease risk, which is our number one killer. But how much is truly optimal? Shoulder shrug, Interestingly enough, if we do look at some of these pre-industrial ancestral diets, they likely had upwards of 100 grams of fiber per day, which is almost sort of mind-boggling. That just sort of sounds so incredibly high. But we have to be careful to assume that, again, that wasn't optimal in all ways. It might just be literally that's the food that was available to them, right? But there is something called Burkitt's hypothesis, named for Dennis Burkitt, circa 1969. He was writing about the disparity in diets and health between kind of our modern populations and our non-industrial populations in Uganda. And he was basically suggesting that fiber should be 50 grams or more. And he was really the one who was putting forth ideas that fiber was involved in our health in many more ways than just keeping a regular GI system. And there is some research to suggest that health risk continues to decline with further increasing your fiber, but we're certainly not at a point to be able to say, okay, you definitely need, 50 grams or you need 75 or something like that. I will say from a practical perspective, I think fiber in the 40s plus range is quite easy to do with a mostly whole and food diet, maybe even into the 50s. But do you need to be there? Is it better than the 14 grams per 1,000 calories? again, shrug. Remember, 5% of us are getting near 30 grams. And so we're not going to have a ton of data to be able to parse out and be like, okay, 40 is better than 45 and so on.
Yeah.
And so if you want to go higher, fine enough. I wouldn't get super obsessed with it and nor develop kind of a more is better philosophy around it. And certainly I think your GI system will let you know when you're kind of pushing the limits there. Yeah.
Got it. Okay. So maybe more practically speaking, we talked about fiber coming from plant foods, like what foods, what kinds of food should we be looking at to increase such that maybe we're not in that or so that we can get into that 5% of the population are actually getting enough.
Yeah. And you'll also hear when people are looking at, okay, what foods are good for fiber, you're also going to hear about different fiber types, which is, again, how we start getting this conversation starts to be kind of a complicated topic. You think like, oh, I just thought I was talking about fiber. And it's like, oh my gosh, now we have to worry about all these fiber types and which foods. And so we're going to kind of give a broad kind of overview of that. Of course, with everything in biology, there's exceptions. And so we can't go into all of them. But in terms of different fiber types that you're going to hear about, they're going to talk about them in terms of their solubility, their viscosity, as well as their fermentability. So solubility is probably the most common way that you've heard to describe fiber. It's either soluble or insoluble fiber. And it's meaning, okay, do the particles dissolve in water? If they don't, it's insoluble, and then it tends to help with laxation or regularity. And generally, cereals and whole grains tend to be more insoluble fiber. Now, if it's soluble, it dissolves in water, of course, and the fruits and veggies are generally better sources of soluble fiber. And if it's soluble, it also can be classified as viscous, which means does it kind of form a gel as it's breaking down in the water, as well as whether or not it's fermentable. So for those fiber types that are viscous, you do want to think about it kind of like a thick gel. It thickens when it's mixed with water. It will move more slowly, of course, because now you've got this thick gel instead of water. And so viscous soluble fibers are the ones that tend to slow down movement in the GI tract and also therefore is going to help you feel more full. And so this is when you've heard about like fiber helps you feel full. It's because it's literally slowing down the movement in the GI tract. And it's also then these soluble fibers that can be fermentable. And so fermentable is when the fiber is broken down by the bugs or the microorganisms in your colon. So again, the fiber does not get broken down and digested in the small intestine. It moves on to the colon. And the fermentation process is when those microorganisms are breaking down the fiber, creating energy for themselves, as well as creating these byproduct molecules that we call short-chain fatty acids, and then, of course, gas as well. And so this is how food you eat has kind of a direct effect on your gut health because you're kind of fueling the gut bugs. But fibers can have a mix of these properties. Like there's a fiber called beta-glucan that's high in oats. It's soluble, viscous, and fermentable. But then psyllium husk is soluble, viscous, and non-fermentable. And then like insoluble fibers are not viscous, but they can be fermentable to varying degrees. That would be resistant starch. So it gets really complicated very quickly to try to remember, okay, this type of food has this type of fiber and what does it do? Because in application, we find that there's kind of good benefits of all of them. And so that's why, some of my recommendations are so simple. It's like eat a wide array of, whole unprocessed foods. Because guess what? You're going to cover your different fiber types instead of trying to remember like, okay, cellulose is insoluble, inulin is fermentable, and et cetera.
Yeah, that seems exhausting. I like your approach more.
Totally.
Okay, so it's non-essential, but and I think you said non-essential and underrated.
Yeah.
I think is what you said. So, what are some of the health reasons that fiber is underrated? Like, and maybe what are some of the benefits of actually increasing what our intake is, like getting enough, maybe?
Totally. Yeah, to me, I mean, it's not surprising, I guess, because fiber is in fruits and vegetables. But just like I say for fruits and vegetables, I would say the same for fiber. It's like, find me the health outcome that you want that's not associated with eating this thing. I mean, fruits and vegetables are that way, and it's going to be very similar to fiber as well. There's so many different health outcomes that improve when fiber is in the diet. So for some examples, there was a rather large review. It's by Reynolds in the show notes. They found that dietary fiber reduces mortality from cardiac disease, stroke, type 2 diabetes, and colon cancer by about 20% compared to low fiber intake. So a couple things on that. Cardiovascular disease and cancer are our two top killers in the US, and colon cancer has the highest death rate of cancers in the US once you remove lung cancer cases that are due from smoking. And so when we're looking for things that improve our health, the fact that fiber can reduce our risk for dying of cardiovascular disease and colon cancer, which is up there, for what we're dying from, we should take note. Now, I do want to highlight that reduction risk was one of 20%. To put that in absolute terms, the absolute risk for somebody getting colon cancer in the US is about 5 in 100. So then having a high fiber diet would take this down to about 4 in 100. That's not to diminish the effects of fiber. 20% risk reduction when we're talking about dietary exposures is actually relatively high. But of course, there's going to be things like genetics that are just going to have a much stronger pull on disease progression. Okay, other effects of having fiber in your diet. There's a review paper by Veronese. They found that that high fiber diet reduces, again, cardiovascular disease risk, so kind of confirming that, as well as a reduced risk of pancreatic and gastric cancers. There's a review by Farvid in the show notes that found higher fiber reduced pre- and post-menopausal breast cancer. And just kind of confirming the evidence that we just suggested with that Reynolds paper of this reduced risk of some of our top killers. Another reason why I think fiber is underrelated is related to weight, which of course is a popular goal that we talk about a lot. It seems to help weight loss. And so there's this really interesting study from 2019. I guess it's McKentinus in the show notes. They were basically looking at about 340 individuals who were going to go on a reduced calorie diet, and they were reducing their calories by about 750, which is a lot. And so they looked at them at the beginning and end of about 6 months on this caloric restricted diet, and they found that it was fiber intake that predicted how much weight they lost. Not the calories consumed, not the macronutrient distribution, but fiber consumption. And if you were looking between, the high fiber consuming group and the low fiber consuming groups, those that were eating the high fiber amounts, they lost about 6 to 8 more pounds over those 6 months in the low fiber group, which is, in my opinion, quite significant, of course, statistically significant. Now, our listeners know that calorie reduction that's driving the weight loss, it doesn't come down to just looking at fiber, but this just shows that why successful diets can't just look at reducing calories. We have to think about, can the person stick to this diet? Are they feeling full? Can they sustain that caloric deficit? And so I'm guessing that the reason that fiber predicted the weight loss was because these are really the satisfying diets so that people could really sustain them.
Can you explain maybe how and why fiber, I imagine it is, but is it just beyond the satiety effect?
Yeah.
Or likely that it is?
Yeah, for the weight loss, definitely. There is that slowing effect of keeping food in the GI tract longer, for sure. And that's going to help just feel like you literally just ate longer, of course. And that's going to reduce you wanting to eat. But what's also interesting is we talked about the fact that when fiber is fermented in the colon, it produces these byproducts, some of which are these short chain fatty acids. Well, we're learning that these short chain fatty acids play a role in appetite. So it's not just the fact that you have stuff sitting in your GI tract longer. You also have the fact that the byproducts are getting involved in our appetite signaling. So that is interesting from the weight loss perspective. From the reduced risk in terms of heart disease, one of the mechanisms for heart disease is that these cholesterol molecules start to form these plaques in the artery, and that can eventually develop into a total blockage, and therefore we develop a heart attack. And we talked about this in the saturated fat cholesterol heart disease podcast. There's certainly many factors that come into play for somebody having heart disease, and so I know it doesn't come down to just a high fat diet or something like that. But diet is one of those factors. And what we find that's really interesting about soluble fiber is that it can actually lower cholesterol. And how does it do that? Remember, it forms this viscous gel in your GI tract. It can literally then prevent the absorption of other nutrients, because it's kind of like, again, a gel. It's like attracting things and sticking things to it. So it can literally prevent cholesterol from being absorbed and therefore lower your cholesterol, because now the cholesterol molecules are just going to go out the back door. And so they find that eating 5 to 10 grams of soluble fiber can help lower LDL cholesterol by 5 to 10 points. Pretty interesting there. And we also know, again, those short chain fatty acid molecules, they are quite powerful. We find that they can inhibit cholesterol synthesis. So when your fiber gets broken down in the colon, and it produces these short chain fatty acids. Not only might they be helping regulate appetite, they also might be inhibiting cholesterol synthesis. Psyllium husk is a really popular soluble fiber. It's actually in the product Metamucil or whatever. But yeah, this is just one of those examples of kind of what might help with cholesterol. And then one more mechanism we'll kind of touch on is the one related to cancer. We mentioned that fiber has this ability, it looks like, to lower the risk of colon cancer. We talked about some of the mechanisms for what might happen in something like colon cancer in that recent nitrates episode, and that was the development potentially of these harmful compounds called nitrosamines. Nitrosamines are carcinogens, and what fiber can do to protect us against carcinogens, especially in something like the colon, is help move the food through at a faster rate. Instead of having things sit in your colon for days on end and now having a regular GI system, some of the compounds that are harmful have literally less time to maybe interact in a negative way. And we also know, again, short chain fatty acids come into play potentially by inhibiting cancer growth. So sometimes fiber will just literally improve the transit time, so we don't have as much time to get exposed to something harmful. But then again, with the fiber that gets broken down, these short chain fatty acids might not just help in appetite regulation, might not just help in inhibiting cholesterol synthesis, might also inhibit cancer growth. So again, they look to be very powerful with many different applications in health, all coming from eating a non-essential nutrient.
We've talked before about gut health.
Mm-hmm.
I think we did a whole episode on gut health. But now you just mentioned it kind of in terms of a potential health mechanism to a degree.
Yeah.
Is there anything worth kind of unpacking there or going a little bit deeper on that?
Yeah, gut health is definitely quite trendy. And I will say that fiber helps your gut health. And that's about all I can say. I think there's this idea out there that we know exactly how to manipulate the gut to produce optimal health, and we don't. What we know is that fiber tends to result in having the populations that seem to be healthy, that other compounds in plants like phytochemicals seem to be associated with having populations of the microorganisms that come up with healthy people. But we don't know which exact species, how many of them should be. And we also don't know that if somebody has a disease state, if we alter their microbiota in a specific way, does it improve the disease? We don't know that it works that way. So I think it's important to keep in mind that while gut health is important, we don't have the exact mechanisms and knowledge to do it in a really specific way to be therapeutic. We don't know, like I said, is eating 45 grams of fiber better or worse than 55 grams of fiber? We don't know that if somebody's otherwise healthy, if they take something like inulin or psyllium husk, if it's going to be any more optimal than not. It's like shoulder shrug. So this idea that we have kind of a perfect endpoint of what our gut health should look like, we're just not there yet, despite what you might see in TikTok. And so I encourage people to go back and listen to the gut health episode, because we go into way more detail about that and kind of limitations there.
Got it. Okay. So you mentioned Metamucil.
Yeah.
I think that's a supplement, though.
Yes.
I don't know for sure. But it makes me think about, one, are there fiber supplements? I imagine there are, because there's supplements for everything. And if so, what's your take on fiber supplements as an approach, again, to get ourselves into that 5%?
Yeah, I don't think it's a big surprise. I'm probably not going to recommend fiber supplements. We've probably talked about them before. If I would, I really would encourage people to get your fiber dose from your food. In fact, a lot of the research that we've just even discussed has been done by looking at food, not isolated fiber supplements. In fact, that large study that I talked about by Reynolds looking at cardiovascular disease and colon cancer risk, they specifically excluded the studies that used fiber supplements. And they point out that some of those studies that look at using fiber supplements don't show as powerful an effect as when you're getting fiber from food. And it might just be so simple as, okay, well, no surprise, when you're getting it from food, you're getting more nutrients, maybe the vitamins and minerals. It might be because of the satiety, because you have to chew and the thing has to sit in your, all of those other things. But I think that's important to keep in mind, that if the research is showing all this protective effects of fiber, and most of it is then coming when we look at food, then that's what we want to do to emulate it, right? We don't want to just go for the isolated compound. Yeah, I mean, it just sort of reminds me of, when people want to supplement with a multivitamin. It's like, no, we want to supplement with the food because, again, that's where the value is. We don't want to get too isolated. I don't want to say that there's never a time for fiber supplements, especially with GI-specific disorders. If somebody has IBS or somebody has colitis, which is part of IBD, so many other of these disorders, I think there can be different supplements, whether or not it's a prebiotic, whether or not it's some of these fibers that can help them. But it needs to be a very targeted approach, not just sort of take any fiber off the shelf, because they have differing effects. And that's why an individual really needs to work with a qualified healthcare provider versus me just being like, everybody should take Metamucil. And then just for otherwise healthy individuals, again, I would stick with getting your dose from food. Is it harmful if you're otherwise healthy and you're eating a good amount of fruits and veggies and you're at your goal weight? Is it harmful for you to take some additional Metamucil or to take some additional inulin? No. But at the same time, do we know that it's doing anything above and beyond where you already are? Also no.
So should we just, everybody, listening, myself included, should we just assume that we are in the 95% here? There's nothing that we need to do, or there's no way to check. It's with a number like that, it's just like, we're just in it. Let's just assume that and act accordingly. But like, is there a good way to say like, oh, am I, like, I'm close, but am I deficient in this?
Yeah.
Or is it just like, let's just assume we are?
It's probably a pretty good assumption. That's a pretty high number, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I would say, we've been beating the drum for quite some time on fruits and veggies. So I think out of all populations out there, we might have a higher representation of adequate fiber than other podcast listenership, right? So I would hope that
if there were fiber wars, we would win them.
But obviously, like all of these questions, how much am I over in sodium? Am I over in fat, saturated fat targets? It's always like, okay, well, let's just measure it. And what's really interesting, interesting to me as a nutrition dork is, the 800-gram challenge, while I love it, does not guarantee that you're going to hit your fiber targets. Some of it's just based on the fruits and veggies you select, but also it's just a fraction of the calories you need. So you're very unlikely to be getting all of your fiber you need just from the 800-gram challenge. So, take a day, and it doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to take an hour plus. You just jot down, okay, the foods I ate and the fiber in them, and you're going to very quickly see, am I anywhere near 30 grams plus in a day? Yeah. Yeah.
And that was going to be my actual last question, which is, I'm sure you go from being very diligent on tracking and just knowing where you are and not having to, do you track fiber? Is that something you do on any kind of regular basis? Maybe it's like kind of like you just insinuated, like every 3 months, just take a day and add them to the Post-it note. Or is it something that you look at with some kind of frequency?
It is part of what we look at in my Masterclass. And I typically do the weighing and measuring all the foods with my Masterclass. So I am at a pretty good clip of every 4 months.
Nice. Yep.
Seeing where I fall. And I very much easily hit in that 40 grams range of the fiber. Yeah.
Okay. EC, anything else on fiber to wrap this up? Or are we good to go?
Hopefully people stayed through the whole thing instead of just hearing it was about fiber and hanging up,
All right. Well, to those of you who are still here, thank you so much for listening. Thank you for your ratings and your reviews. EC and I will be back next week for another episode of The Consistency Project.